There is a moment coming. You may not see it yet, but it is already forming somewhere out there, in a mind that has spent weeks or months convincing itself it did not need you. And when that moment arrives, you will feel it before you understand it. A message, a silence that changes texture, a version of them that sounds almost unrecognizable, softer, slower, like something in them finally cracked open. And here is the terrifying part. Most people miss it completely. They are so exhausted from waiting, so bruised from the back and forth, that when the real shift finally happens, they either pounce on it too fast and scare it back into hiding, or they are so numb from protecting themselves that they do not even register it as real. This video is for the version of you that refuses to let that happen. The version of you that is done reacting on impulse and ready to actually understand what is happening inside the person who hurt you, so that when they come back trying to earn something from you, you know exactly what it means and exactly what to do with it. Let's talk about what earning trust back actually looks like from someone wired to avoid closeness, because it does not look like what your heart wants it to look like. It is not going to be a grand gesture. It is not going to be a tearful confession delivered like a movie scene. Avoidant energy does not work like that, and if you keep waiting for a cinematic moment, you will miss the real one every single time. The real one is quiet. It is uncomfortable. It often looks like distance that suddenly has a different quality to it, less cold, more aching. It looks like someone who used to disappear without a word, suddenly leaving a door cracked open, unsure if they are even allowed back in. Trust, for an avoidant nervous system, is not rebuilt through words. It is rebuilt through consistency they cannot fake, discomfort they cannot avoid, and time they cannot rush. Think of trust in this context like a plant that was stepped on. It is not dead, but you cannot yank it back into shape by pulling on it. You cannot force growth by demanding proof of love on your timeline. It needs conditions, steady light, time without disruption, and most importantly, it needs you to stop hovering over it, checking every hour if it has grown back yet. The moment you obsess over the plant, you crush it further. The moment you leave it be, under the right conditions, it starts finding its own way back toward you. So what does it actually feel like when an avoidant partner or ex begins the process of earning trust back? It rarely feels like relief. It often feels like confusion. Because avoidant attachment is built on a foundation of self-protection so deep that even the person carrying it does not always know why they do what they do. When they start to soften, they are fighting an internal war you cannot see. Part of them wants closeness so badly it aches, and another part of them is terrified that closeness is the very thing that will destroy them. This is not weakness. This is not manipulation, most of the time. This is a nervous system that learned somewhere along the way that intimacy equals danger, that being needed equals being trapped, that vulnerability equals the possibility of annihilation. You need to understand this because your instinct, the human instinct, when someone finally starts moving toward you again, is to open the floodgates, to finally say everything you have been holding in, to finally ask for everything you have been denied. And that instinct, understandable as it is, can undo months of healing in a single conversation. Because when an avoidant person begins to soften and feels the full weight of your unprocessed pain rushing at them all at once, their nervous system does not interpret that as intimacy. It interprets it as threat, and threat triggers retreat. This is the paradox you must sit with. The very moment they start to come closer is often the most fragile moment in the entire dynamic. Not because you did anything wrong by having feelings, you are allowed every single one of them, but because timing here is not just important, it is everything. Let's talk about the psychology underneath all of this, because understanding it will change how you interpret every signal you receive from now on. Avoidant attachment typically forms early, in environments where a person's emotional needs were met inconsistently, dismissed, or punished in some subtle way. Maybe caregivers were emotionally unavailable. Maybe vulnerability was mocked or ignored. Maybe love came with conditions that made a child learn, on some cellular level, that needing others was dangerous, that self-reliance was safety, and that closeness always eventually led to disappointment or engulfment. That child grows into an adult who craves connection just like everyone else, but who has built an entire internal architecture designed to prevent themselves from ever feeling out of control in a relationship. When someone with this wiring finally starts to want to earn your trust back, it means something enormous has shifted internally. It usually means the discomfort of losing you has finally outweighed the discomfort of intimacy. That is not a small thing. That is often the first time in their entire life that connection has won over self-protection. And that is precisely why you cannot treat it like an ordinary relationship repair. This is not two securely attached people working through a conflict. This is someone dismantling years, sometimes decades of internal wiring in real time, often without even fully understanding what they are doing or why. Now here is where we get to the heart of this video, because you came here for a reason. You want to know when you should break no contact. You want to know when the silence you have been holding, the distance you have been protecting yourself with, should finally end so you can let them back in. And the truth is, most people ask this question far too early, driven by longing rather than clarity. So let's talk about what actually needs to happen before you even consider ending that silence. The first thing to look for is not what they say to you. It is what they do when they think you are not watching for it. Avoidant people, when they are genuinely trying to earn trust back, tend to change their behavior in the spaces where there is no audience. They start showing up differently in ways that have nothing to do with impressing you. They begin doing the internal work, whether that is therapy, self-reflection, or simply sitting with discomfort instead of running from it. Not because they are performing for you, but because something inside them finally broke open enough to make change necessary. If the only version of change you are seeing is performative, only visible when they know it might reach you, that is not trust rebuilding. That is strategy. And strategy without internal transformation collapses the second real intimacy is required again. The second thing to watch for is consistency without a demand for reward. This is crucial and painfully counterintuitive. An avoidant person who is actually doing the work will not immediately expect access back into your life the moment they feel a little better. In fact, one of the clearest signs of authentic change is patience, the ability to show up steadily without pushing for immediate reconciliation. If they are pressuring you to respond faster, to forgive faster, to forget faster, they are still operating from the old pattern, the one where their comfort matters more than the relationship's actual healing. Real change sounds like acceptance of your pace, even when it is agonizing for them. Fake change sounds like urgency dressed up as love. The third marker, and this one is subtle but incredibly telling, is whether they can tolerate your pain without trying to fix it, minimize it, or flee from it. Avoidant people historically struggle with this more than almost anything else. Your hurt, your anger, your grief, these things used to send them running or shutting down or intellectualizing the conversation until the emotion disappeared from the room. When someone begins to earn trust back in a real way, you will notice they can sit with your pain without flinching. They do not rush to explain themselves the second you express hurt. They do not change the subject. They let it exist in the room, uncomfortable as that is for them, because they finally understand that your pain is not an attack. It is information, and it deserves space. Now let's talk about timing, because this is where so many people get it catastrophically wrong. There is a temptation, once you notice even a flicker of these signs, to immediately break your silence and rush back in, thinking this is your proof, your permission slip to reopen the door. But here is what you need to understand about premature reconciliation with an avoidant partner. If you reach out before they have had enough sustained time to actually integrate the change, rather than simply feel a temporary surge of longing or guilt, you risk collapsing the very growth you were waiting for. Think about it like tempering steel. Steel becomes strong not through heat alone, but through a specific process of heating and cooling, repeated until the metal's internal structure stabilizes into something resilient. If you interrupt that process too early, pulling the metal out before it is properly cooled, it becomes brittle, prone to shattering under pressure. An avoidant person's internal change works similarly. The discomfort of missing you, of sitting in consequence, of confronting their own patterns, that is the heat. If you rush in and remove the heat too soon, offering comfort and closeness before the internal restructuring has had time to set, you often get someone who reverts right back to old patterns the moment real intimacy resumes. because the change was never given enough time to become structural. So when should you actually break no contact? Not when you miss them enough that the silence becomes unbearable. Not when a single sweet message arrives that makes your chest ache with hope. Not when you catch wind that they have been asking about you or seem to be struggling. Those are all valid feelings, but none of them are reliable signals. You break no contact when the evidence of change has been sustained long enough that it has stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a pattern. This usually means observing consistency over an extended stretch of time, not a burst of effort followed by silence, not one heartfelt message followed by disappearance, but a rhythm, a steadiness, a version of them that shows up the same way on their hardest days as they do on their easiest ones. You also break no contact when you yourself have done enough internal work that you are no longer approaching the reunion from a place of desperation. This part matters more than almost anything else in this entire conversation, and it is the part people skip because it requires looking inward instead of outward. If you are still checking for signs constantly, still organizing your entire emotional world around whether they will come back, still feeling like your worth is suspended in midair waiting for their validation, then even if they have done real work, you are not yet in a stable enough place to re-enter that dynamic without recreating the very imbalance that hurt you in the first place. This is where so many people misunderstand no contact entirely. They treat it like a waiting room, a place where you sit with your arms crossed until the other person delivers enough proof to summon you back. But no contact, done properly, is not about them at all. It is about you rebuilding a sense of self that does not collapse the second someone withdraws affection. It is about becoming someone who can recognize genuine change specifically because you are no longer starving for it. Starvation distorts perception. When you are desperate for any sign of hope, your brain will manufacture meaning out of the smallest crumb, a single word, a subtle emoji, a mutual friend's comment, anything, because desperation needs evidence far less than it needs relief. But when you have actually filled yourself back up, rebuilt your sense of identity outside of them, reconnected with your own life, your judgment sharpens. You stop mistaking crumbs for meals. You start being able to tell the difference between someone performing change and someone who has genuinely become different. Let's go deeper into the specific emotional signals that indicate real internal work is happening, because this is the part that will actually protect you moving forward. One of the most powerful signs is when an avoidant person begins expressing accountability without immediately following it with justification. This is huge because historically their apologies, if they even offered them, were often layered with explanations designed to soften the blame, to make their withdrawal understandable, to shift at least part of the responsibility onto circumstances or onto you. When real change occurs, the accountability starts standing on its own. It does not need padding. It does not need an immediate pivot to explaining why they were the way they were. There is a stillness to it, an ownership that does not flinch or backpedal. Another sign is emotional specificity. Avoidant people, prior to doing real work, tend to speak about feelings in vague, sanitized terms, because specificity requires vulnerability, and vulnerability was the very thing they spent their life avoiding. When something shifts internally, their language changes. Instead of saying they were confused, they might actually articulate what confusion felt like in their body, where they felt it, what thoughts spiraled underneath it. This kind of granular emotional language does not come from nowhere. It comes from someone who has actually sat with themselves long enough to develop the vocabulary for what used to be an unexamined fog. A third sign, and one people often overlook because it seems almost too simple, is whether they can talk about the relationship's ending without centering their own suffering entirely. Early on, an unhealed avoidant person, even when trying to reconnect, tends to frame the story in a way that positions their own confusion, fear, or overwhelm as the main event, with your pain treated almost as a footnote. When real growth has occurred, there is room in the story for both experiences. They can acknowledge what the ending did to you specifically, in detail, without immediately needing to redirect attention back to their own inner turmoil. This shift, from self-centered narrative to shared narrative, is one of the most reliable indicators that something has genuinely matured inside them. Now, let's address the deep fear sitting underneath everything we have talked about so far, The fear that if you wait too long, if you hold your boundary too firmly, if you do not respond the second they show interest, you will lose the window entirely and they will move on, disappear, or find someone else. This fear is powerful because it plays directly into the scarcity that heartbreak creates. When you have been hurt, your brain becomes hyper alert to the possibility of further loss, which makes patience feel like danger rather than wisdom. But here's the truth you need sitting in your chest permanently from this point forward. A person who is capable of genuinely earning trust back, who is doing the internal work necessary to become someone safe to reconnect with, is not going to be scared off by healthy boundaries. In fact, healthy boundaries are often the very thing that finally earns their respect, sometimes for the first time in the entire relationship. Avoidant people, ironically, often lose interest fastest in situations where there is no boundary at all, where access is unconditional, where they can retreat and return without consequence, because that dynamic confirms their deepest fear, that they can do anything and still be loved unconditionally, which paradoxically makes the connection feel less significant, less earned, less real. When you hold a boundary, when you require consistency and time before re-entry, you are not pushing them away. You are, whether you realize it or not, offering them the exact structure their nervous system actually respects. Structure feels like safety to an avoidant mind, even when it initially feels like rejection. Let's pause here and validate something, because this entire process is exhausting, and you deserve to hear that plainly. Waiting while healing, watching for signs while trying not to obsess over them, holding boundaries while your heart aches for softness. This is one of the hardest emotional tightropes a person can walk. If you have found yourself crying over silence, rereading old messages, wondering if you are doing this whole no contact thing wrong, you are not broken, and you are not doing it wrong. You are a person with a nervous system that craves connection, trying to override that craving with wisdom, and that internal tug of war is genuinely one of the most difficult things a human being can experience. Give yourself credit for surviving days you did not think you would survive. Now let's talk about what happens on the other side, once you have both broken no contact and started to test the waters of reconnection, because knowing when to reach out is only half of the equation. The other half is knowing how to move once you do. The instinct, once contact resumes, is often to move quickly, to make up for lost time, to dive straight back into the emotional depth you once had, as though the relationship never paused. This is almost always a mistake with someone recovering from avoidant patterns. Reconnection needs to happen in layers, slowly, almost the way you would reintroduce someone to solid food after they have been unable to eat for a long time. You do not hand them a feast on day one. You start light. You start with lower stakes conversation, allowing safety to rebuild gradually, before introducing the heavier emotional material, the unresolved grievances, the deep questions about the future. If you flood the reconnection with intensity immediately, you risk overwhelming a nervous system that is still fragile, still learning how to stay present instead of flee. Pay attention during this period to how they respond under pressure, because pressure will inevitably arise, whether from an accidental comment that stings, an old wound resurfacing, or simply the natural friction of two people renegotiating trust. The way they handle friction in this early reconnection window tells you almost everything about whether the change is durable or temporary. Do they stay present through discomfort, or do their old patterns of withdrawal reappear the second things get difficult? One uncomfortable moment does not mean failure. Everyone regresses sometimes under stress. But the question is whether they can catch themselves, name what is happening, and return to the conversation, rather than disappearing into silence the way they may have in the past. There is also something important to understand about your own role in this reconnection, because trust rebuilding is not a one-directional performance, where they prove themselves and you simply observe from a safe distance. You too will be tested, in the sense that your own patterns, whatever they might be, anxious pursuit, fear of abandonment, difficulty trusting positive change, will surface as well. Healing an avoidant dynamic is not just about them becoming capable of intimacy. It is about both people learning a new way of relating that does not repeat the exact rhythm that broke things in the first place. If you find yourself reverting instantly into old patterns of chasing, over-explaining, or needing constant reassurance, that is worth noticing too. Not as a failure, but as information about the areas you still need to strengthen within yourself. Let's return to the emotional undercurrent that so many people feel but rarely articulate clearly. The fear that even if all the signs point toward real change, you might still get hurt again. This fear is legitimate, and no amount of positive signals can fully erase risk from human connection. But here is something worth sitting with. The goal was never to guarantee zero risk. Love, real love, has never come with a guarantee. The goal is to move forward with clarity instead of blind hope, with discernment instead of desperation, so that even if things do not work out the way you want, you can trust that you made the decision from a grounded place rather than a starved one. That distinction changes everything about how you will feel afterward, regardless of the outcome. There is one more layer to this conversation that deserves real attention, and it is the difference between someone earning trust back because they genuinely want to repair the relationship versus someone earning trust back because they cannot tolerate the idea of you moving on without them. These two motivations can look remarkably similar on the surface, but they lead to completely different outcomes. The first motivation is rooted in genuine desire for connection and growth. The second is rooted in ego, in the discomfort of losing control, in the inability to accept that someone they once had access to might now be building a life that does not require them. How do you tell the difference? Pay close attention to what happens when you show signs of moving forward independent of them. If their efforts to reconnect intensify, specifically in response to your growing independence, if you notice a pattern where they seem to reach out with more urgency right after you post about a new opportunity, seem happier, or start speaking about your life with less reference to them, that is often more about their fear of losing relevance than genuine desire for repair. Real change does not spike in response to your progress. Real change is steady regardless of what you are doing, because it comes from an internal shift in them, not from external competition with your healing. Another important distinction lies in whether their attempts to reconnect come with patience for your questions or defensiveness toward them. If you ask about what specifically changed, how they plan to handle similar situations differently in the future, what internal work they have actually done, and they respond with frustration, impatience, or accusations that you are interrogating them instead of trusting them, this is an enormous red flag. Someone who has genuinely done the work welcomes these questions because they understand that trust is not an entitlement. It is something built through demonstrated understanding, and they have nothing to hide from a process of honest reflection. Let's talk too about the physical and emotional sensations you might notice in yourself as all of this unfolds, because your body often knows things before your mind fully processes them. When someone's change is authentic, there is often a subtle sense of calm that settles into your interactions with them, even amid the natural nervousness of reconnecting. Their presence starts to feel less like walking on ice and more like standing on solid, if still unfamiliar ground. When someone's change is performative or temporary, your body often knows this before your conscious mind catches up. You may notice a persistent undercurrent of unease, a feeling that you are still managing them rather than simply being with them, a sense that you are still responsible for keeping the peace, softening your needs, or anticipating their reactions before expressing yourself honestly. Learn to trust this instinct. Your nervous system has been collecting data this entire time, even during the silence of no contact, and it often understands the truth of a situation long before your hopeful mind is willing to admit it. Now, an important warning, because this entire conversation can easily be twisted into something dangerous if misunderstood. None of this is meant to encourage you to wait indefinitely, hoping for change that may never come, sacrificing years of your life sitting in a holding pattern for someone who might never actually walk through the door. Time itself is not proof of anything. What matters is what happens within that time. If months pass and you observe genuine, consistent, internally motivated change, that is meaningful. If months pass and all you observe is silence, punctuated by intermittent flickers of interest, with no substantive difference in behavior, that is not evidence of impending transformation. That is simply the absence of change dressed up in the appearance of a process. Do not confuse duration with depth. A relationship can remain stagnant for a very long time, and stagnation should never be mistaken for the slow unfolding of growth. This is why self-awareness during this entire waiting period matters so profoundly. You must become someone capable of holding two truths simultaneously, remaining open to the possibility of genuine repair, while also refusing to abandon your own life and self-worth in service of a hope that may never materialize. This is not a contradiction. This is emotional maturity. You can leave the door open a crack while still building a house that does not depend on anyone walking through it. Let's also address something that rarely gets said directly in these conversations. The possibility that even after all of this, even after witnessing real change, real accountability, real consistency, you might discover, upon reconnecting, that you yourself have changed too much to want what you once wanted. This happens far more often than people expect, and it is not a failure of the process, it is actually one of its most beautiful potential outcomes. Sometimes, the very act of building yourself back up during no contact reveals to you that the life you are constructing without them has become more fulfilling, more peaceful, more aligned with who you are becoming than the life you would return to with them. If this happens, it does not mean any of the waiting was wasted. It means the waiting did exactly what it was supposed to do. It gave you enough distance to see clearly, rather than through the fog of longing. Let's talk about the emotional architecture of patience itself, because patience, in this context, is not passive. It is one of the most active, demanding forms of emotional labor a person can undertake. Choosing not to reach out when every part of you wants to, choosing to keep living your life fully instead of pausing it in anticipation, choosing to interpret ambiguous signals with caution rather than desperate hope. All of this requires a level of internal discipline that most people underestimate until they are forced to practice it themselves. If you are in the middle of this process right now, understand that every day you choose grounded patience over impulsive reaction is a day you are quietly becoming someone stronger than you were before this entire situation began. There is also something worth naming about the strange grief that exists specifically within this waiting period. A grief that does not look like traditional mourning, because the person has not fully left your life, yet the relationship as it once existed absolutely has. You are grieving a version of them, and a version of the connection, that may or may not ever return, while simultaneously trying to remain open enough to receive it if it does. This ambiguous grief is uniquely disorienting, because grief typically wants closure, wants a clear ending to process, and this situation offers neither closure nor certainty. Learning to sit with this particular flavor of unresolved sorrow, without forcing false closure through either premature reconciliation or premature finality, is one of the quiet, unglamorous forms of strength this entire process demands of you. Let's circle back to the practical question sitting underneath everything. When exactly should you break no contact once you believe the signs are real? The honest answer is that there is no universal number of days or weeks that applies to every situation, because every nervous system, every relationship, every wound heals on its own timeline. What matters far more than a specific duration is the quality of what you are observing. You are looking for repetition without demand, accountability without justification, emotional specificity instead of vague reassurance, patience with your pace instead of pressure for quick resolution, and steadiness that exists independent of your own visible progress or apparent happiness. When you observe this cluster of signals repeated consistently, not once, not twice, but as an established pattern over meaningful time, and when you yourself feel grounded enough to re-enter the dynamic without abandoning the self you have rebuilt, that is when breaking no contact becomes not a reckless leap of hope, but a considered decision made from clarity. And if that moment never comes, if the silence simply continues, or if what little contact resumes never solidifies into anything resembling the pattern described here, let that be its own answer. Not every story is meant to circle back to its beginning. Some are meant to end so that something else, something you cannot yet imagine, has room to begin. Either outcome, reunion built on real change, or a closed chapter that frees you into something new, is survivable. Both are, in their own way, forms of the peace you have been looking for this entire time, whether you realized it or not. You did not come into this situation by choice. The hurt was not something you invited, but the way you walk through the aftermath, the discernment you build, the patience you cultivate, the self-respect you refuse to abandon even while your heart aches for something familiar, that is entirely within your hands. Whatever they decide to do with the time they have left to earn something back, you are already, in this very moment, becoming someone capable of recognizing truth when it finally arrives, and strong enough to walk away cleanly if it never does.